The Stone Maidens, Chapter 1, Milagros Riquelme. Towards the end of summer, the wind came strong from the north. It blew for weeks at a time, sweeping over flat grasslands and marshes, ruffling reeds and ancient ombu trees and green scummy waters, swinging sparse dark clumps of cypress and Spanish moss. It conquered the stone towers and balustrades of the big house in Altagracia. It hammered on the corrugated iron roofs and adobe walls of the houses and ranches in the village. It sneaked through cracks in the roofs and windows and beneath door sills, coating everything with layers of fine red dust. For days afterwards, the women swept and scrubbed and washed, from the multicolored tiles on the verandas of the big house to the gold brocade mantle of the Virgin in the chapel, from the whitewashed walls of the tiny schoolroom to the earth floors of peasant ranches. Everything had acquired a smell of soil and a reddish hue it took weeks to get rid of. Milagros and the other children loved it. They ran against the wind and screamed with delight. They howled and shrieked with laughter as the red dust choked them. They spat and hissed and fought against the wind, hair and arms going wild, looking like demented windmills. Countless small insects came riding with the wind too, dry and buzzing and biting. They drove the cattle mad. The gauchos chased the insects away with their long whips of many tails. The children ran after the riding men, teasing, taunting, but always taking care to stay well out of reach of the lead balls at the end of the leather strips. When they were breathless with running, they abandoned the chase and turned to catching as many insects as they could. They put them in matchboxes if they could find any, or just collected them in heaps. Then they buried them. The insect funerals were long and elaborate. At the head of the procession, one child chanted gibberish through the nose, holding a makeshift cross. Then followed the coffin bearers, holding the tiny boxes or the naked dead insects solemnly in front of their skinny little chests. The mourners came behind them, boys looking down on the earth or rolling their eyes to the heavens and swearing revenge, girls wailing and moaning and tearing their hair, the solemnity often interrupted by pushes, tumbles, and giggles. The insects were buried in shallow graves just outside the wooden fence of the real graveyard. The children had been told it was as great a sin to bury animals in consecrated ground as it was to bury Christians out with its boundaries. The dry, windy season brought human funerals too. The whole village turned up at them. It was a show of respect and one of the few entertainments locally available. Children were not normally allowed to attend, but followed at a safe distance nevertheless, their avid faces drinking in the sights of the grown-ups' distress, picking up every little detail of moist eye and downturned mouth and bent head. Milagros herself was as familiar with death as any of them. The fourth of 6 siblings, she was the only one to survive infancy. When she was born, her mother and grandmother consulted together and decided to force a miracle out of the Virgin Mother. They named her Milagros, and it had worked. She had no memories of her siblings at all, besides a very vague recollection of the funeral for the youngest, Jorge Luis. Her father had held the small coffin himself. She had followed behind, holding Ioulia's hand tightly. Her mother had walked next to her, holding her other hand, head held high and eyes burning with a fiery grief. Doña Alejandra from the big house made an appearance in the black and silver Rolls-Royce, driven by old man Suarez, instead of driving herself to the church in her Morris Mini. People agreed that this showed compassion for the poor Riquelmes, having to bury their 5th child. When the family returned home, the little Moses basket where the baby had been sleeping was waiting for them in the corner. Her father silently took it away. During that night, Milagros had woken up several times, straining her ears to hear the sick baby's whimpering, but all she could hear was the wind sweeping dust and thorny balls of dried weeds in the deserted village road, all the way to the cemetery. Milagros often thought of the dead at night as she lay in bed curled up next to Ioulia. She pictured the quiet cemetery in her head, the little graves neat and clean, her brothers and sisters resting in the well-swept, flower-covered earth. Sometimes she worried about them when it was a moonlit night. Her chest hurt as she thought of all that weight of dirt falling on their little chests, of how deeply they lay. How could they breathe under the earth? But when it was raining or when the wind was howling, she thought they would be rather warm and snug and out of harm's way, cocooned in their little boxes, tucked in safely in their beds of earth. She would then listen for the sounds of the night. She would hold her breath in the darkness, trying to block the sound of Abuela's raspy breathing and the irregular snores and sighs through the partitions separating the rooms from her parents' bedroom, and the scuttling of mice inside the adobe and straw walls. There were voices in the howling wind. She was certain. Urgent whispers in the persistent beating of the rain on the tin roof. She would pull herself close to Abuela, who always slept with a rosary entwined in her hands, in case death came during the night, her fingers twitching as if counting beads even in her sleep. The old woman slept lightly. "What is it, Millie? Why aren't you sleeping?" Abuela would whisper, the sound of S coming funny through her toothless mouth. "Abuelita, do you hear?" "Hear what, daughter?" "I don't know. It's like words." "Don't worry, my dove, it's only the wind." "But there are voices in there." "Of course there are voices." The snoring in the next room stopped. "What are they?" Milagro's voice was barely a whisper now. "It's the dead. They're trying to speak to their loved ones." "What are they saying?" "Unfortunately, we do not know their language." "They don't speak our language?" "No, you see, they're in another country now. They speak different there." "Shut up!" A choking voice would come through the cardboard thin wall. They would stop talking immediately, and as Abuelita counted her rosary beads to lull herself back to sleep, Milagro stayed awake for just a little longer, eyes wide open in the darkness, ears straining to hear. Could it be that her brothers and sisters wanted to tell her something? Everybody knew the dead slept in peace, but of course they ought to wake up sometimes. Maybe this was when the living went to bed. Milagros would shut her eyes tightly and picture the small cemetery under the moonlight. Tall, thin wooden crosses shaking slowly in the night air, tattered flower crowns hanging from them, wooden railings around them to keep the wild animals away. They certainly woke up, but did they rise? Did they walk? Did they run against the wind? Yes, probably, and that's why she could hear them from all that distance away. Always she wondered what they were trying to say. But as she lay there listening, wondering, her head would fall heavy over her chest and her eyelids would relax, and in the short moment when sleep was hanging above her like a thick drop of honey from the spoon's end, she could hear the voices more clearly, the urgent whispers, persistent, susurrant, rising and falling with the wind.